Starfield is the game that once and for all proved there is such thing as being too big.
That's too big.
With Starfield, Bethesda managed to produce a game that has more surface area than the average American wasteland, and yet somehow feels emptier than a politician's promise. But why was Starfield such a disappointing failure? Well, long-time Bethesda critics say it's all down to their design philosophy. According to this popular view, the methodology Bethesda used to create popular, wildly successful and acclaimed games like Skyrim was in fact fundamentally flawed at the time and is positively archaic now. So much so that a Starfield-like catastrophe was simply inevitable. As you might have realized by my tone, this explanation never really won me over. Not because I'm a silly Bethesda fanboy. I'll be the first to say that the trade-offs they frequently accepted in pursuit of a more open player experience sometimes produced very questionable outcomes.
That really pisses me off. Oh no, what do we do?
In fact, my most successful long-form video focuses entirely on this. But this critique just doesn't work for Starfield because it's simply nothing like any other Bethesda game. Pick up Starfield for a second and you'll immediately recognize how mechanically different it is to, let's say, Skyrim, Oblivion, or any of the classic Bethesda titles. This is Fallout 4.
Not interfere. Our intentions are peaceful.
And this is Starfield. And this shift can't be ignored if we are to really understand what went wrong with Starfield and how Bethesda can turn a new page or scroll in the future. So why does Starfield feel so different from previous Bethesda titles? Well, the easiest place to start is with its open world. As I hinted at earlier, Bethesda has always been a studio focused more than anything else on enhancing the openness of their worlds. The classic Bethesda open world was vast, open, and completely engrossing with bucket loads of sheer atmosphere. When you visualize Skyrim, in my opinion, the peak of this model, what comes to mind? The dialogue and narrative, or the almost gentle, wispy plumes of smoke that envelop the calm oasis of Whiterun, or the ethereal, meditative rhythm of the soundtrack? In other words, Bethesda always brought the vibes. Yes. Now, the word vibe immediately hints at some sort of short-term, pleasurable activity like...
Would you like a taste?
It's a great idea.
So it might sound like I'm minimizing what Bethesda achieved, but at their best, Bethesda produced games with such an unforgettable sense of atmosphere that they still hold to this day. Skyrim, which in my opinion is the peak of this formula, has such a distinct vibe that in the last year it spawned a channel with millions and millions of views just consisting of a guy in front of a green screen soaking up the vibes. Now, I'm not saying Starfield is completely lacking in atmosphere. Every time I land on a dark, newly discovered planet with nothing in sight, an unforgettable sense of peaceful oblivion washes over me as the ethereal soundtrack intertwines with the sheer vastness of the environments, producing a truly unique sensation. But these moments last all of 5 minutes because this is Starfield.
I'll see you around.
A game that takes the theme of emptiness a little too literally. But why is this the case? Why does Starfield's atmosphere never really take hold of us like in Skyrim or the Fallout games? Well, to explain this, I'll have to dig a little deeper and really flesh out the methodology Bethesda used to create games in what I'll call their golden age from Morrowind to Fallout 4. But before I do this, I just want to remind you guys to like and subscribe. Most of my regular viewers are currently not subscribed, and where else am I going to get the money to afford my Creation Club mods? Come on guys. Anyway, let's get back to the video. A common critique of Bethesda's approach to designing open worlds is that they're far more focused on giving players choices than making sure each one has actual impact. And undeniably, this holds true for their quest design, combat, and to a lesser extent, some of the role-playing mechanics like item creation and magics. But to see these flaws in isolation fails to really get at what makes Bethesda games so unique. You see, Todd Howard and his team didn't just forget to write compelling characters or intertwining storylines. They decided to sacrifice these elements to focus overwhelmingly on creating highly immersive and unique environments. Worlds so compelling that we can't help but be sucked into them over and over again. And this attention to detail in their environments is, in my mind, really what differentiated Bethesda from the competition. You see, at the time and to this day, most open world RPGs were aiming for greater scope and variety of things. They thought that if simply making buildings grander or more colourful, that people would be drawn towards them and dazzled. But Todd Howard knew that people value distinctiveness more than they value variety. And so making each individual piece feel far more distinctive than the competition is what would allow their games to really stand out more than scope or variety. This is why, compared to releases at the time, and especially today, Bethesda games felt extremely small scale. Their settlements, dungeons, were far less varied and smaller in size than the competition. If you don't believe me, just think. How many Skyrim dungeons are not the same model of barrows, dwarven ruins, camps, or keeps, virtually copy and pasted over and over again? And how do its main cities compare to even the smallest villages in The Witcher, let alone Novigrad or Oxenfurt? Now this might sound bad on paper, but as I hinted, this gave Bethesda worlds a much more intimate, personal, and handcrafted feeling than most others. That's why you can barely remember the details of the last Dragon's Dogma 2 dungeon you blundered into, and yet can vividly recall the gigantic steps of Bleakfall Barrows and the steam-stoked ruins of the lost Dwemer civilization, like you were only there a moment ago. So why did Bethesda change this formula? Why does Starfield feel so different? Well, it all comes down to the question of scale.
And it's probably girthy too.
Ironically, since Skyrim, despite the fact that its success came not from Bethesda's focus on scope, but on their commitment to a smaller scale, very atmospheric vibe, the tremendous financial earthquake created by its release inadvertently kickstarted a race amongst devs to build bigger and bigger open worlds. And Bethesda were unwilling to let the competition bypass them in this regard. And so they were determined to reclaim their place at the top of the RPG pile by leaping past the competition with worlds even bigger than we'd ever seen before. And to do this, just like a Catholic priest, they had to make a difficult choice to abandon the intimacy they were known for before. And just like any Catholic priest, this very commitment created many problems. You see, by abandoning the cohesive, fairly small scale and intimate open worlds of yore, Bethesda had to find another way to tie together the player experience. This is already enough of a challenge for a standard open world RPG because the illusion of player freedom is everything. So devs had to find a way to subtly direct players towards certain routes or through certain mechanics to ensure that their best content isn't simply missed. But with a gigantic space opera like Starfield, the challenge this presents was amplified infinitely. You see, Starfield was on such a grand scale and so open that it would be impossible to create a cohesive gameplay DNA that ties together the sheer diversity of player approaches. In the same way that even though you can kind of do what you want in Fallout 3 or Fallout 4 or Skyrim, there's an open world that ties together the whole experience. On top of this, they could no longer rely on their hubs to pick up because they simply lacked either the time or resources to make sure all of these cities, bases, and homesteads felt as iconic as the Boston Wasteland or the holds of Skyrim. So they had to find another way to hook players in, and this supposed solution is what made Starfield not only feel fundamentally un-Bethesda, but also generic and frustrating to play through. They thought, well, if we can't give Starfield a gameplay DNA that ties together the player experience, why even bother? Let's just double down on this lack of identity by offering the player so many different options that most will never even access them, and let each one choose between these options to craft their own gameplay loop. And let's hope the exploration ties the whole thing together. Now in concept, this isn't a bad idea. If Harry wants to spend 50 years building bases and John just wants to explore, and they can both do this within the same game, everyone's happy. But in practice, it requires a tremendous, almost impossible level of attention to detail for a game this size. To pull it off, Bethesda would have to have ensured that each new feature and style of playing was deep and distinct enough from the competition to satisfy each niche of RPG fan. And the sheer immensity of the development cycle shows they really tried to make this work. They really did. No matter what anyone says, Starfield didn't fail because of the lack of effort, but it just didn't come together. Fans who love large, immensely detailed hubs to explore were let down by uninspired, boring, and at times just weird settlements at the base game. The story-focused types were let down by the often lackluster and at times overtly terrible storytelling. And the sort of guys who live and breathe exploring a new place they spotted over the horizon were let down by the lack of horizons and abundance of loading screens in their place.
All of this just works. I'm not kidding.
Leaving, well, no one happy, and Starfield with no clear identity, transforming Bethesda into a caricature of their past self.
Actually hard to imagine getting paid for this sometimes.
Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and let me know in the comments if you're interested in one focusing more on where Bethesda can go from here than just critiquing their approach.